The first scene of this new 4-part lesbian anthology begins with an apparently ordinary delivery that gradually becomes an unexpected encounter between two women whose lives become connected through shared memories, athletic culture, and a growing recognition that the identities they perform for others do not necessarily contain everything they feel. The opening is deliberately domestic. Lewis arrives carrying apples from his mother, and the exchange initially feels like a simple neighborly favor. The apples are associated with generosity, home, and the routines of everyday life, while the cheerleading uniform immediately establishes the younger woman's place within a recognizable social world. Yet the conversation quickly becomes more personal when the older woman reveals that she was once a cheerleader herself. What begins as casual nostalgia therefore becomes a bridge between generations. She brings out her old uniform, and the younger woman responds with genuine enthusiasm, noticing the similarities between the two outfits. This visual echo matters because clothing becomes a record of identity. The older woman is not simply showing an old costume, she is revealing a version of herself that existed before marriage, domestic expectations, and the accumulated responsibilities of adulthood. Her memories of cheerleading and later softball suggest that her past contained friendships, ambitions, confidence, and forms of belonging that may have become less visible with time. The younger woman, meanwhile, represents someone still standing at the threshold of adulthood, surrounded by assumptions about what girls are supposed to want and whom they are supposed to notice. Their conversation about softball players pursuing cheerleaders introduces one of the scene's central ideas. Women can become accustomed to being positioned within heterosexual social scripts, even when their own emotional lives are more complicated. The younger woman's observation that softball girls were always chasing cheerleaders is playful, but it also exposes how deeply heterosexual expectations can structure social life. Girls learn which friendships are supposed to be harmless, which compliments are acceptable, and which forms of admiration are expected to remain within particular boundaries. The older woman's response, that things were different in her time, adds another layer. She remembers a period when the rules surrounding identity may have felt even less flexible, making the gap between what she experienced privately and what she could acknowledge publicly especially significant. The scene does not need to turn her past into a definitive declaration to make the emotional implication meaningful. Instead, it presents memory as a space where forgotten possibilities can return. The cheerleading uniform becomes symbolic of a younger self that has not completely disappeared. When the younger woman suggests that the older woman's athletic past might explain why she joined softball, the conversation becomes more probing. Her question about the older woman's separation from Mr. Lewis also touches the pressure of marriage and family expectations. The older woman initially refuses to discuss it, establishing a boundary around a painful subject. That hesitation is important because queer self-recognition rarely occurs in a vacuum. It can emerge alongside relationships, responsibilities, and identities that once seemed permanent. A person may spend years being understood primarily through roles such as wife, mother, teammate, employee, or caretaker before realizing that those roles do not exhaust who she is. The younger woman's curiosity therefore functions as both a challenge and an invitation. She senses that there is a story beneath the surface, even if she cannot fully name it. The later emotional turn is presented through the language of returning to the past. The younger woman encourages the older woman to close her eyes and revisit her softball days, transforming nostalgia into a metaphor for recovering an earlier sense of possibility. The exact physical details suggested by the source material are unnecessary to understand the emotional function of this moment. What matters is the sudden collapse of distance between past and present. The older woman, who has spent years moving through socially recognizable roles, is confronted with a younger person who sees her not only as someone's wife or mother, but as a woman with a history of her own. That recognition can be powerful for anyone, but it has particular resonance for queer women whose identities have sometimes been obscured by compulsory heterosexuality. The scene suggests that self-recognition may arrive through another woman's willingness to look beyond the official biography. Rather than asking only who the older woman is supposed to be, the younger woman becomes interested in who she once was and who she might still be. This is where the anthology's premise becomes especially significant. Cheerleaders have conventionally been represented through a heterosexual gaze, often as symbols of popularity, desirability, and youthful femininity. This story redirects attention toward the women themselves. The women are not merely being watched, they are remembering, questioning, and recognizing one another. That shift is central to lesbian storytelling. A familiar cultural image can be transformed when the women inside it are allowed to possess their own interiority. The cheer uniform no longer means only attractiveness or school spirit. It becomes a marker of memory, community, and continuity between different stages of a woman's life. The older woman's recollections of softball similarly broaden the idea of femininity. Athletic women are often forced into simplistic categories, as though competence, physical confidence, femininity, and queerness cannot coexist comfortably. Her past challenges those assumptions. She could be athletic then and polished now. She could have changed her appearance without erasing her earlier self. She could have formed important friendships in environments where women were expected to compete for male attention. The scene consequently makes room for a more expansive understanding of womanhood. It also emphasizes the importance of women's friendships. The older woman remembers making important friendships during college, and this detail is easy to overlook because it appears in a conversation about uniforms. Yet friendship is one of the emotional foundations of many queer lives. Before someone can name a romantic identity, they may experience intense connection through friendship, mentorship, teams, clubs, or chosen communities. These relationships can become spaces for self-discovery because they offer forms of closeness that do not always fit the rigid categories imposed by mainstream culture. For queer women especially, admiration of another woman can carry multiple meanings at once. A younger woman may admire an older woman's confidence, style, athletic history, independence, or emotional openness. That admiration can be platonic, aspirational, romantic, or some mixture of all three. The ambiguity itself matters because society often demands immediate categorization. Lesbian and bisexual women may recognize the experience of wondering whether an intense attachment is friendship, attraction, identification, or a desire to become more like the person being admired. The scene does not need to resolve that uncertainty immediately. Its strength comes from allowing hesitation to remain meaningful. The older woman's nervousness also matters. She is not portrayed as someone who has everything figured out. Her responses suggest someone negotiating change, memory, and vulnerability. The younger woman likewise expresses nervousness near the end, and the older woman responds by encouraging her to relax. That exchange creates a reciprocal emotional rhythm. One woman may possess more life experience, but neither is presented as completely invulnerable. The older woman can be uncertain about what comes next, while the younger woman can be uncertain about what she feels. Their connection, therefore, becomes less about one person teaching another and more about two people recognizing something in each other. This is especially important when discussing lesbian relationships because queer narratives have historically been vulnerable to stereotypes that reduce women's connections to either scandal or fantasy. A more grounded interpretation asks what emotional need the relationship satisfies. Here, the answer appears connected to being seen. The older woman is seen as more than a domestic figure. The younger woman is seen as more than a cheerleader. Each becomes a person rather than a social role. That process of being seen can be profoundly affirming. The scene also invites criticism because its power dynamics are not entirely simple. The women occupy different positions in age and experience, and the older woman is connected to the younger woman's family through Lewis and his mother. Those relationships create boundaries that deserve attention. Queer intimacy does not automatically become ethically uncomplicated simply because it involves women. Power, age, social status, and existing commitments still matter. A thoughtful reading therefore resists romanticizing every boundary crossing. Instead, the scene can be understood as dramatizing the tension between the desire for authenticity and responsibility toward others. The older woman's initial reluctance is meaningful precisely because she recognizes that consequences exist. Her hesitation shows that self-discovery is not merely about following an impulse. It involves considering what honesty means when other people are affected. That ethical dimension makes the story more interesting than a simple forbidden romance premise. It also connects to the broader experiences of women who are taught to prioritize stability. Women are frequently expected to maintain households, protect family feelings, preserve appearances, and absorb emotional burdens quietly. When someone begins questioning those expectations, the resulting uncertainty can be frightening. The older woman's memories suggest that part of her life may have been placed on hold. Her interaction with the younger woman creates a moment where that suppressed self becomes visible again. For LGBTQ+ viewers, this can resonate with the experience of realizing that authenticity sometimes requires revisiting parts of oneself that were dismissed, forgotten, or never given language. The scene's treatment of hesitation is therefore particularly valuable. Queer people are often taught to monitor themselves closely. They may wonder whether a compliment is too affectionate, whether a friendship appears too intense, whether a personal disclosure is safe, or whether acknowledging attraction will alter an important relationship. This constant self-monitoring can make ordinary emotional experiences feel risky. The younger woman's nervousness near the conclusion captures that uncertainty without requiring a dramatic declaration. She does not suddenly become a completely different person. Instead, she remains nervous, and the older woman responds with reassurance. That is a small but meaningful image of care. It suggests that intimacy can involve making another person feel safe enough to remain uncertain. The scene also challenges the assumption that women's relationships must be defined by male attention. Lewis appears only briefly, yet the conversation surrounding him reveals how strongly heterosexual frameworks organize the women's circumstances. The younger woman recognizes the older woman's marital difficulties, but the emotional center of the scene gradually moves away from the man and toward the women's shared conversation. This is not necessarily an argument that men are irrelevant. Rather, it allows women to become subjects of their own story. The premise that cheerleaders are traditionally objects of desire is therefore inverted. The important question becomes not who desires the cheerleaders, but what the women themselves remember, value, and recognize in one another. That reversal has broader cultural significance. Lesbian visibility is often trapped between erasure and sensationalism. In one mode, women's love for women is treated as invisible, temporary, or merely experimental. In another, it is exaggerated into spectacle. Both approaches can prevent queer women from appearing as ordinary people with complicated emotional lives. A story centered on memory, uncertainty, and recognition can resist both extremes by insisting that queer connection deserves the same emotional seriousness granted to heterosexual relationships. The older woman's recollection of her athletic past also suggests that identity is not a straight line. People change careers, appearances, relationships, communities, and priorities. A woman who once played softball may later become someone who seems completely different, yet the earlier self remains part of her. Queer identity can similarly involve layers rather than a single revelation. Some people recognize themselves early, others reinterpret their histories later. A woman may look back at an intense friendship, an unexplained fascination, or a period of emotional closeness and understand it differently with age. The scene leaves space for that retrospective recognition. It also highlights the importance of intergenerational queer connection. Younger women can sometimes provide older women with a language for possibilities that were unavailable to them earlier, while older women can offer younger women evidence that identity can survive change. Such relationships need not become romantic to be significant. Mentorship, friendship, admiration, and chosen family can all provide forms of belonging that challenge isolation. The scene's emotional architecture therefore reaches beyond the two characters. It asks what happens when women give one another permission to remember. It asks what happens when a person who has spent years fulfilling expectations is suddenly encouraged to consider her own happiness. It asks why women so often need permission in the first place. Those questions extend beyond sexuality. Many women, regardless of orientation, understand the exhaustion of being expected to remain composed, responsible, attractive, accommodating, and emotionally available. The older woman's transition from discussing domestic life to recalling her younger self embodies the possibility of stepping outside those demands, even briefly. The younger woman, meanwhile, stands at a formative point where she is learning that adulthood does not have to mean surrendering curiosity or authenticity. Their interaction becomes a quiet study of how people help one another become more visible to themselves. The ending, with the younger woman admitting nervousness and the older woman offering reassurance, preserves ambiguity rather than forcing a neat conclusion. That restraint is valuable. The story does not need a grand speech to communicate that something has shifted. The shift exists in the recognition that both women have crossed an emotional threshold. The younger woman has encountered an older woman whose history complicates her assumptions, and the older woman has encountered someone who reminds her that earlier parts of herself still matter. For lesbian and bisexual viewers, that recognition may feel familiar because queer identity often develops through moments that initially seem too small to explain. A conversation that lingers, an unexpected feeling of being understood, admiration that becomes difficult to categorize, or the sudden realization that another woman sees a part of you others have ignored. None of these moments automatically determine identity, but they can open a door to self-questioning. The scene ultimately works best when understood not as a story about provocation, but as a story about visibility. Its most compelling idea is that women are more than the roles assigned to them. A cheerleader can be an athlete, a friend, a daughter, a partner, or someone discovering a new understanding of herself. An older woman can be a mother or wife while still possessing memories, desires, ambitions, and unanswered questions that belong uniquely to her. Queer storytelling becomes powerful when it permits these contradictions to coexist. Instead of asking women to choose between respectability and authenticity, it can acknowledge the complicated process of negotiating both. This scene uses the familiar symbols of cheerleading, athletics, family, and nostalgia to explore that negotiation. The result is an emotionally grounded portrait of two women encountering the possibility that their lives can be understood through something other than the expectations surrounding them. Their connection matters because it creates recognition, and recognition is often the beginning of change. For audiences of LGBTQ+ women, the scene can therefore resonate as a reminder that self-discovery does not always arrive through dramatic declarations. Sometimes it begins with a uniform taken from a closet, a memory shared across generations, a question that reveals more than intended, or a moment when another woman quietly communicates that uncertainty does not have to be frightening. Those gestures can carry profound meaning because they challenge a culture that has often asked women to make themselves smaller, simpler, and easier to understand. Here, the women are allowed to remain complicated. Their pasts matter, their uncertainty matters, and their capacity to recognize one another matters. The anthology's larger premise is consequently transformed from a familiar image into a statement about agency. Cheerleaders may have been culturally framed through other people's expectations, but But this story asks viewers to look inward, toward the women themselves. What they remember, what they question, and what they choose to acknowledge becomes more important than the gaze imposed upon them. In that sense, the first scene establishes a foundation for the anthology. Lesbian connection is not inherently a spectacle or a scandal. It can be a quiet encounter with another person that makes hidden parts of the self easier to see. The scene's deepest emotional movement is therefore from performance toward recognition, from prescribed identity toward possibility, and from isolation toward connection. That movement is meaningful not because it provides an easy answer, but because it honors the uncertainty that often accompanies genuine self-understanding. The women do not need to explain everything immediately. They only need to begin listening to what their memories and emotions are telling them. By ending on reassurance rather than certainty, the scene leaves that process open. It recognizes that becoming visible to oneself can take time, and that sometimes the most important thing another woman can offer is not an answer, but the feeling that you do not have to be afraid of the question.